You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek. Welcome to Dr. Geek's Laboratory.
Hello everyone, Dr. Geek here with a shout out to all the scientists who worked tirelessly to bring a COVID-19 vaccine into reality. Let's face it, creating something of this magnitude is a miracle worthy of Dr. McCoy himself. And now, Dr. Geek needs you to do your part. Remember, each shot is one small step back to normal, one giant leap to putting the pandemic behind us. We can do this. For more information, visit vaccines.gov to find your nearest provider.
Hello and welcome to the 42 Cast, your ultimate answer to fandom, geekiness, and everything. As always, I am your host Nathan, and we have another great episode lined up for you where I get to interview John Peel. John Peel is an author who worked on Doctor Who, both fiction and non-fiction, about the series in the 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s. He's written for Star Trek, he's written for The Outer Limits. He writes a lot of his own original fiction, and lately he's been writing for the character of Dr. Omega, which is a character that actually comes from French science fiction around the turn of the century, and that's a whole other story that we're going to get into, and the possibility that Dr. Omega may have actually inspired Doctor Who. But John was very generous with his time. He sat down with me and we talked for a good hour about the different projects that he's worked on, sort of the course of his career, and mostly about Doctor Who, but a few other things as well. It was pretty cool, pretty interesting. So, if you're a longtime Doctor Who fan and you were in the scene where you were reading the novels back then, I think this will be very fascinating. And I think even for people now who are kind of curious about Doctor Who original fiction, and how all that stuff came about, or if you want to learn about a series that you might want to get into that's going on right now, which is the Dr. Omega stuff, or Dr. Omega, if you're on the other side of the pond, we talk about that too. So, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in here. The one thing I will note is that John raises lovebirds. Those are a kind of parrot, and they are audible during the podcast. So just so you know, during the recording, they were definitely making some noise, and so you can hear that. You can definitely hear what John is saying. It's not like they overpower it, but I'm just letting you know that there will be sounds in there. Otherwise, not much else to report right now. Beth and I, are continuing to do well in our sort of quarantine, lockdown, thing. We're not really relaxing, right now. We're still going out with masks and everything just because we want to make sure that everything is perfectly safe. Want to make sure our kids get vaccinated first. Our oldest is going to get vaccinated soon because that's a thing now. And yeah, so I'm not going to take up any more time talking about that. So let's go to a promo for another fine podcast, and then we'll get on with the interview with John.
Are you tired of podcasts only covering good movies or bad movies? Where could you possibly turn to find both in one convenient place?
There has got to be a better way.
Well, now there is. Try the podcast Double-Edged Double Bill, where Adam and Thomas dive into both a good and a bad film in every episode. Sound too good to be true? Well, listen to this testimonial.
Double-Edged Double Bill got me to watch Total Recall and Junior in one night. I was both entertained and scarred permanently. Thanks, Double-Edged Double Bill.
Available now on the ESO Network and wherever podcasts are streamed.
And we're back. And like I mentioned at the top of the show, we have author John Peel with us today. John, welcome to the 42 Cast.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. I've actually been reading your books since I was 9 years old.
That's kind of encouraging and not encouraging at the same time. In the fact so long, it's very nice, but
Well, you don't know how old I am, so I mean, there you go. So, it could be any length of time, really. But how are you holding up with all this quarantining, and even though it's sort of relaxing now and everything? How are things going?
oh well, I always stayed at home anyway to do the writing, so that's not affected me in the slightest. Just that I always like to be able to relax at the end of a day, and that would generally involve going to shops or just playing around, and I can't do that now, so I've had to discover a few extra things to do instead. Other than that, hopefully the quarantine will be lifting soon, so I'm looking forward to being able to run around and do things again.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that one because it's gone on a lot longer than I thought it would. I know.
Yeah, I was expecting maybe 3 months. 15 months ago.
Right. All right. So you've been a fan of Doctor Who for a very long time now. Were you someone who was watching with the very first episode of An Unearthly Child?
No, I didn't start at the beginning, not the first episode or anything. What happened was, back in those days, you had to turn your TV on 5 minutes or so before you actually wanted it to give it time to warm up and actually produce a picture. And we had thought, we'd seen a listing for Doctor Who, and this was the time of all those medical dramas. Dr. Kildare was hugely popular. And we thought, oh, it's just another one of those medical dramas, and we ignored it. And we wanted to watch what was on after Doctor Who one night. And this was actually when they aired the 4th episode, the end of Tribe of Gum. And so we turned the TV on a little early, and we see these cavemen, and there's a police box in the middle of nowhere, and these figures running towards it and having spears chucked at them, and we're watching it going, if this is a medical show, I mean, so then of course we got the sequence where they run inside into the TARDIS and take off, and by that point we were hooked. I mean, my entire family were like, what is this? We've got to watch it. Watched the first episode of the Daleks, of course. That was next week, and that was it. I mean, once we saw the first episode of the Daleks, there was no way we weren't watching the show. So pretty much from that point on, we were watching it.
Oh, that's really awesome. Now, in those days, was it considered a phenomenon? Was it hugely popular, or did it take time for it to sort of build into the thing that it is today?
It took 2 weeks. The second episode of the Daleks, once the Daleks appeared, I'm not joking here, we would go, I was 9 years old, so the school was at the top of the street where I lived, so we went to school, and all the kids were going, exterminate, exterminate, and going around the schoolyard. They had their hands out in the right positions and everything, and it was just phenomenal. And each week, more people were coming into it. It was a huge success. The BBC was caught cold with it. They never expected anything like that. But the story, it just drove everybody crazy. And it lasted for a good long time, actually. I remember as a kid, we went on holiday one time, and I went into a Woolworths, and they had all these Dalek jigsaws all over the place, and Dalek little rollikins, they were called, tiny little Daleks, around, and it was everywhere. It was literally everywhere. I mean, Daleks were like an infestation. There was nothing like it. There was nothing, and it was huge, and there really wasn't anything at all like that until Thunderbirds came along couple of years later, and then that sort of took over instead, and it was Thunderbirds mania instead of Dalek mania. But the Daleks had just made such an impact; it was incredible.
So, have you been a fan of Doctor Who all through that period, or have you come and gone from the series at different periods?
I came and went, really. I remember I missed a good deal of the third season of Hartnell after watching the Daleks, of course. But I remember I can't remember why. Oh, that was 60. That would be 65. So it was probably Thunderbirds, which had come on at that point. Although I'm not sure that they were on the same night. I can't really remember, but I know we missed a few.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the regeneration into Pat Troughton, I was absolutely appalled. I was like, what has happened? You know, I couldn't take this new idiot in the place of the Doctor.
Yeah, it must have been a real shock at the time, because I mean, like, no show had ever done that before.
And it was just so weird. I mean, I liked the Daleks in the story, but I wasn't at all sure I liked this Doctor. I do remember catching bits of other episodes, but only bits. I know I didn't see the Highlanders, and I did see Moonbase. With this, I think because the Sidemen were back, that's why I watched that one. But then there was a gap, and the next one I can clearly remember seeing was the Mind Robber. So I mean, it was like most of Troughton's era I missed, and I watched the Mind Robber, and that started me watching it again. But once the regeneration to Pertwee came about, that was when I really, really, really started dedicatedly watching every single episode. I would not miss any. I just adored the early Pertwees, and it just kept getting better and better as far as I was concerned. So I've been watching it since quite avidly.
Do you have a favorite Doctor?
Oh, well, Hartnell, of course, because he was the one I came in on. And I think after that, probably Pertwee. It's hard to decide because, I mean, Hartnell was the first. So, you know, he started it all for me. But Pertwee was the one that really grabbed me. And that was when everything started happening. I mean, with the Pertwee era, we started getting the Target books and other things. So it was like a major growth spurt at that point. And then, of course, when Tom Baker came in, the early Tom Bakers, they were just, you know, magnificent, really. So it just kept building and building again, which was terrific.
So with how the series has gone and how many of the Doctors have pulled in more of those comedic elements, have you gone back to Troughton and sort of reevaluated Troughton from your initial impression of him?
Oh, very much so. When the videos started coming out, and I had a chance to catch up on the episodes I'd missed, I was kicking myself. I was like, how could I have not liked this? You know, I think the first one I caught of the Troughtons that I missed was Tomb of the Cybermen, and I mean, I was just entranced with that one. That was just such a good story, so well done. And as each one has come out, watching them again, well, some of them again, most of them for the first time, I was very much more impressed, especially with Pat Troughton. I mean, Pat, he's such a great actor, and his characterization and mannerisms are just beautiful. It was exactly what they really needed after the first Doctor to completely alter the scope of the show, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, if it was just someone pretending to be Hartnell, I don't think the show would have lasted that long.
I don't think it would have lasted a season after that, because nobody could have replaced Hartnell as the first Doctor. Doing this, I mean, it was an incredibly crazy and risky thing to do, regeneration. But it was the only way to go. They were very smart about it. They realized that they couldn't replace Hartnell, so they had to just sidetrack and go into a different direction. And that worked beautifully.
In the 70s, like you mentioned, that's sort of when fandom really took off because there were the Target books. I know that that's when Terrence Dicks published a book about the making of Doctor Who, and there are several things that happened there. And of course, fanzines started up in the 70s. So were you involved in sort of those fanzine type projects and things of that nature?
Oh, yes. I was dragged in fact. What happened was there was a fan group called Doctor Who Appreciation Society.
Mm-hmm.
Advertised that they needed members in some comic publication that we read. A friend of mine, Steve Evans, and we met every Saturday evening to watch either Doctor Who, Star Trek, or Lost in Space, whatever was on at that particular hour, because the BBC rotated them. Mm-hmm. We would watch the show, and then we'd go upstairs and sit and write our own stories. And we had gotten this magazine, and there was this advertisement, and Steve said, "Oh, I think I want to join that. You can, come on, we'll both do it." And I sort of said, "Oh, all right, yeah, okay," because I'm not very much of a joiner. I don't join, so he dragged me into it. We paid our money. We got a subscription. We got the TARDIS magazine, which came out whenever they found enough material to publish one. I've always been terribly opinionated when it comes to stories, and there was this terrible story from my point of view, published in the fanzine, and I wrote a letter to the editor saying, "Can't you do any better than that?" As I said, I've always been very opinionated, even back then. So he actually wrote back to me, and he said, "No, can you do any better?" So that was it. Steve and I decided we'd prove that you could do Doctor Who stories properly. So we wrote 5 or 6 stories between us. He wrote one, I wrote one, and we sent them into the editor, Gordon Blows. And Gordon loved them. And he said, "I'm going to print them all in a special issue. And what we need is a writer's pool to produce writers that can write stories for the magazines." And he said, and he asked Steve and I to take charge of it, which was insane because we had no idea what we were doing. I mean, we were just fans writing stories we liked. But I got inveigled into editing this with Steve. And then Steve, who was always very moody, said, "I'm fed up of this," and quit and left me to do it all by myself, which I did for a couple of years. But then at the end of that was the time I was coming to America. So it passed on to other hands, and it's still going strong, I gather. I still see them turning up, which I think is a great thing. I mean, as a writer, that was my start. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very much into fan stories, fan fiction. I think it's a good way of honing your writing skills. You're playing in a world that someone else has created and set the rules to, and it's a lot easier that way. Mm-hmm. So I've always been in favor of it.
This is almost the counterpoint, because Terrence Dicks kind of famously told Paul Cornell, "You don't go into writing for Doctor Who. You go into writing because you want to be a writer," And he says that Paul Cornell proved him wrong because he is someone that came in wanting to write Doctor Who and then from there branched out into other things.
With writing, you get in any way you possibly can. I remember another Terrence Dicks saying was, "Of course it's hard to get into writing. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it." And this is true. It's very hard to get into writing. You just get in any way you can. And then hopefully you've got something in mind once you've gotten there.
So had you been considering writing as your profession before you worked on the fanzine? Or was that something that, working on that, you decided, this is something I want to do full time?
Oh, no. I'd always wanted to be a writer. I remember very clearly wanting to be a writer when I was about 10. And I wrote things from my school magazine. Anything I could write, I would write. And some of them still exist. Goodness me. That was the whole goal. I always wanted to be a writer. As I said, I went over to my friend Steve's house. We would, spend the whole of Saturday evening writing stories. Not together. We very rarely wrote anything together. But he would sit and I would sit, and we would both work on the stories, and then we would read them to each other, and then we would make comments, and everything. So it was a way of practicing. So the fanzine was really the natural progression, and then from that, my idea was to turn professional, and I bugged the editor of Doctor Who Doctor Who Weekly at that point. I said, I have ideas. Can you buy them? And he was like, well, send them to me. And he liked them. So that was really how I got into writing. Doctor Who was my entry point into writing.
Nice. So I believe the next thing that you wrote Doctor Who-wise was the official Doctor Who and the Daleks book that you co-wrote with Terry Nation.
Yeah.
So how did you meet Terry?
I didn't. What happened was St. Martin's Press over here in New York had decided that they wanted to get in on Doctor Who. It had started taking off over here, and they could see that it was going to be quite large, quite big. And they decided they'd love to write, have a book published about some way connected to Doctor Who, because they could see that there was going to be money in it. Smart. And the trouble was the editor didn't know anything about the show. Literally nothing. And he heard that I did, because I was editing a magazine at that time. And he then called me up and explained who he was and what he was doing. And he said, I want to do a Doctor Who book. I've got a few proposals. Can I read them to you? And you can tell me whether they'll work or not. So he started reading these proposals, and they were dreadful. I mean, absolutely dreadful. And I said, no, that won't work. And I mean, one of them, the only one I can remember, it was called something like Why Tom Baker is the Greatest Actor. And I was like, yeah, but if you put that, it'll annoy anybody who likes any of the other ones better. So I said, you won't get very far with that idea. And he went through the whole list, and they were all terrible. And I told him, honestly, you won't get anywhere with any of these ideas. So he said, well, have you got any ideas? And I said, well, Terry Nation wrote this Dalek handbook, pocketbook, Dalek pocketbook, back in the 60s. And I think with a bit of updating, that would do you better. So he said, oh, okay, John, could you contact Terry for us and, see if he's interested? So I'm thinking, all right, yeah. So I did know someone who was in Blake 7 fandom who knew Terry. So I contacted her and I said, could you ask Terry if I can talk to him? And she got me his phone number and passed it on. And I called Terry up. We had a really lovely chat. And I explained what my idea was. And he said, well, John, I'm kind of busy right now on MacGyver. He was working on the first season of MacGyver. He said, but maybe you could have a look to see if you could update the book for me. So I had a look, and I realized updating it really wouldn't work. It would have to be totally rewritten. So I told Terry this, and he said, oh, well, all right, why don't you rewrite it and stick my name on it with you, and we'll, sell it that way. So that was basically how the book came about, mostly over the phone. I mean, I hadn't met the editor. I hadn't met Terry. All I'd gotten was all these telephone conversations. So we started from that. And I met Terry afterwards, after this. But at the time, I hadn't actually physically met him at all.
Okay, interesting. And I imagine that in some way that must have led to doing the novelizations of The Chase and the Daleks Master Plan, because now you have a relationship with him, and those are two stories that hadn't been done by Target yet. So how did that happen?
Well, that was exactly what happened. Every now and again, Target would call up Terry and say, can we have permission to do the Dalek books? You know, the Dalek stories, missing ones. And Terry would always say no, because he'd really not liked the previous couple that they'd done. He thought they were just flimsy nothings, and they weren't appealing to him. But when they called him, as we were writing the Dalek book. They called him and said, "Can we please have the rights for the Dalek books again?" You know, and they were expecting him to say, "No, get lost." And then this time he said, "Can I pick who gets to write them?" And they said, "Sure, yes, absolutely." I mean, if he said, "Can my pet monkey write them?" they would have said yes to that, because it will have had Dalek on the cover. That's what they wanted, because the Dalek books always sold better than any of the other targets.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't care who wrote them as long as they were written, which was lucky, because then Terry called me up and said, "John, dear boy, would you like to write a Dalek novel?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, why?" And he said, "Oh, well, I've just told Target that you're going to." And that was how it happened, literally that easily. I had no idea about it until he'd half negotiated the thing and then called me up. I mean, I don't honestly know if he'd ever seen any fiction that I'd written at that point, but he knew from talking to me that I understood his approach to the Daleks, and he knew that we had the same aims in mind with the Daleks. Mm-hmm. So he felt that he could hand the project over to me and it would be handled in a way that he would approve. So that was pretty much how it all came about. I contacted Target and I said, "Look, I'm not doing a 128-page huge print novelization here. I want to write a proper story, a proper book." And they said, yeah, no problem. As I say, they wanted the Daleks so badly, they would agree to anything. So they agreed to that. And I worked from that and wrote just what I thought was just a regular novel. Mm-hmm. And they laid no restrictions on me whatsoever, which was lovely.
Oh, that is nice. And yeah, I know with the Daleks Master Plan, they get to sell 2 books instead of 1. So, I mean, that's, I'm sure they like that.
That was a funny story, because when we finished The Chase, they liked what I'd done. So they said, "Can we do the next one?" And Terry said, "Sure." And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm happy with it." And I said, "But I am not doing a little book based on 13 episodes." I mean, this was after the War Games had come out, and it was this tiny little volume. And I said, "I'm not doing that." I said, "Either we do a big book, a really big book, like 250 pages, or we do it as 2 smaller books." So they said, "Okay, which would you prefer?" And I said, 2 smaller books. And they said, "Fine, we can do them a month apart. That'll be great." And I called Terry up and told him. And Terry said, "John, why did you say 2 books and not 1 big one?" I said, 2 books, 2 advances. And Terry just broke down laughing, and he said, "John, you're thinking like a real writer now." It was the funniest thing that he'd heard me ever say, I think. So he just loved it. And I didn't actually tell him the other reason why I wanted it as 2 volumes. It was because I wanted to put a gap in the story. So that, because we were coming to the very end at that point of all the stories that hadn't been novelized, and I could see that there were going to be, we would have to do original novels if it was going to go any further. So I wanted to create a gap in which we could add further Hartnell adventures with Sarah Kingdom. Mm-hmm. But I didn't tell Terry that. That would have been too fanish, I think. So I kept that one to myself.
So Big Finish has you to owe for the stories they've done with Sarah Kingdom and Stephen.
Well, I thought there would be some use for it somewhere along the line.
Yeah, before we had all these audio, like people found that people have recorded on audio and everything. That was the only way to appreciate that story was through your novelization. That's
Right.
how I first read it. So it's really great that we got that. And I'm glad that Terry let you do that.
Oh, I was so thrilled with it. It was brilliant.
And then, like you said, Virgin, because they had bought Target, they were working on doing new stories with Doctor Who. And they had this book come out before that called The Gallifrey Chronicles that you wrote.
Yes, that's right.
And so did they approach you about doing that? Or did you pitch that to them? Or how did that happen?
Actually, I don't remember quite. What happened with the Gallifrey Chronicles was when I did the book for St. Martin's, the official Doctor Who and Daleks book, they said, well, we'd like another one after this, please. And I thought, well, to do a full book, you'd have to have something that there was more of. So I pitched the official Doctor Who and the Time Lords book. And they liked the idea, and I sat down drafting concepts and everything for it. And then the sales figures came in for the Dalek book, and it was a lot lower than they had hoped. So they decided, okay, we're not going to do that. But at the time I was talking to my editor at W.H. Allen, I mentioned to him that this had been cancelled. And he said, send me the outline and I'll have a look at it. And he liked it. And we worked from that. I kept saying, how about we do this? How about we do that? And whatever. And he liked the whole idea. And we did the whole book. And then, to my immense surprise, somehow or other, he got permission. The one thing we had trouble with for the Dalek book was getting permission from the BBC to print pictures. They were charging a fortune for photographs, so we couldn't really use very many. And then somehow, in between then and the Gallifrey Chronicles, they'd loosened up, and Gallifrey had so many pictures. I was just amazed. I'm thrilled. I was very happy with it.
Yeah, I actually have Fraser Hines and Wendy Padbury's autographs in my copy of the Gallifrey Chronicles because there's a photo of them from the War Games in there.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Oh, I have a copy I take to conventions as well, and I've gotten about 150 names in it so far. But yes, it's wonderful for that. Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, it's a nice big book too, so they can write nice and large in there. But that sort of was the start of everything that Virgin then went on to do with the New Adventures. It was kind of set out in the Gallifrey Chronicle. I remember reading at the time, I'm a young kid reading this, and it's just like, wow, this is so amazing because this is taking Doctor Who somewhere new.
Right.
Because I, being an American, was lucky enough to watch most of what existed on PBS because they had gone, and where I lived, all the way from Hartnell through to McCoy. And so I had seen most of the stories. So then they start the New Adventures, and you, of course, are the first writer
right
on the New Adventures. And so, again, was that something that was kind of, they came up with the idea and said, hey, we need some writers for this, and asked you, or was that something where you pitched it, or how did that come about?
Oh, well, that was a bit of everything. It was Peter Darvel Evans, the name I was thinking, of course. Peter, I knew he was approaching the point where he was going to be either doing new stories or just stopping the entire line. And I was pitching myself at him to write any new story if it came up. And one day he did call me and he said, okay, John, we're going to do news stories now. We're going to start with this thing. We've got this idea. And he explained very, very vaguely the idea of the time worm, he said. And it's going to be a 4-book series. I want you to write one of them. And I'm like, the heck with one of them. I want to write the first because that would be, from my point of view, as a fan, writing the first original authorized novel was just too appealing. So I literally sat down overnight, wrote a synopsis, sent it to Peter. This was way before computer conversations and email and things. I actually had to fax it to him from some business in town, and I faxed him this idea I had. I came up with this idea because he was explaining that the time worm was this myth and everything, and what have you. And I came up with the idea of a computer mind that used human minds as floppy disks, which shows you how old the story is. Right? Floppy disks. And basically, the idea was that the Doctor and Ace land on this planet, which seems perfectly normal, until all of a sudden everybody switches on and becomes part of the hive mind. And I'd written it, I can't even remember a little bit. I've probably still got the outline somewhere, but I wrote this whole thing up and zipped it to him. And the next day I got a call from Peter saying, John, yes, like the idea, but it won't work because I think I probably forgot to tell you. I wanted something with Mesopotamians in it. Yeah, that you hadn't mentioned that at all. He explained he wanted to do a storyline where it starts in the far past and ends in the far future. And he wanted me to come up with the one for the past. And he said, "Have you ever heard of Gilgamesh?" And I said, "Funny you should mention that." And I reached up on my bookshelf and pulled down my copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I said, "Love it." So he was like, "Great, you're perfect for it then. Write me an outline with Gilgamesh." I said, "Yeah, that's not a problem, but if Gilgamesh is going to be a character, we're going to have a few tricky moments in here." And he says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, he wasn't the nicest guy in the world, you know." And he said, "Don't worry about that." So I said, "Well, I'm going to have to put some sex in there because he was basically the horniest guy on the planet at the time, you know." And people were scared of him because he was strong, but they hated him because he kept going around seducing their wives. And, you know, I can't get away from that. What am I going to do about that? And he said, "Oh, well, John, don't worry about it. No gratuitous sex unless the story calls for it." So I was like, okay. And we did get a little flack, as you probably recall, over the thing. And what he also wanted was that he explained he wanted to reset the show, basically. He was doing it as if he was writing the next season, but he said he wanted to make it science fiction for science fiction readers, not science fiction for Doctor Who readers only. He wanted to expand the market a bit. So he said, you know, he wanted it to be a little more adult, a little bit more depth, a little more thought through. And so we worked from that. But I worked very hard to become the first one to write the thing. In fact, when I met Terence Dix a few years back, I said to Terence, you know, really, you should have been the one to write the first one. And I hope I didn't upset you by beating you to it. He said, "Oh, no, not at all, John. I knew the first one would get all the fans totally irate because it wouldn't be what they wanted." I said, "I want to do the second one because it would be safer." So that was quite funny.
Yeah, Terrence has been playing this game for quite a while, so he was savvy to that kind of thing.
He knew what was coming.
Right, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, but then you didn't write for the New Adventures for the rest of the run. So was there a reason that you didn't write for, or was it just that you were working on other projects and didn't have time?
What happened originally was that I was working on other projects. I think that was when I was doing my first Star Trek book at the same time. And it was an incredibly busy time for me. I remember one year around then I wrote 14 books. So I was getting kind of a lot of things to do. And then by the time I had a look at I was still buying the New Adventures, mostly putting them in a big pile in my closet. But by the time I got around to looking at them and seeing what was happening, I realized that it was going in a direction that I couldn't write. I mean, not necessarily a bad direction. It was just something that I wasn't comfortable working with.
Mm-hmm.
So I just sort of passed after that. I didn't come up with any further ideas. As I say, I was very busy on other things.
Mm-hmm.
And that kept me busy. Otherwise, I would have gone back. And in fact, when BBC Books took over the range, they asked me very early on, would I like to be part of that? And I said, oh, yeah, definitely. I was very happy to go back.
And I know that you wrote a Missing Adventure also for Virgin when they started that line with Evolution. So did they ask you to write a Tom Baker, a Fourth Doctor and Sarah story, or did you get to choose like who you wanted to use in that story?
I pitched. This was when they were starting the line, and Peter told me, look, we're doing this, and you can pick whatever team, TARDIS team you want. And being me, I got greedy. And I said, well, I pitched this idea where the story starts with the third Doctor and Sarah. There's a pause in the middle, and then it picks up again a few years later with the fourth Doctor and Sarah.
Oh, that would have been interesting.
Which I thought would be fun. And I pitched this one to him, and he said, no, we're not doing multiple Doctor adventures yet. No, pick one or the other. So I picked the Tom Baker and Sarah mix, because they were actually my favorite at that point of all time. I just loved those two. The interaction was just brilliant between Tom and Liz.
Mm-hmm.
So it had to be those two. Which I would have loved to have done a Pertwee one, but I never got around to it. And again, I did this one, and I had so much fun with it. It was great fun. I remember when I met Liz, I was working on Evolution when I was doing a convention, and that I had invited Liz, and I got to meet Liz. And I told her I'm doing this book with the Fourth Doctor and Sarah. I said, and Sarah gets to meet her writing idol. And Liz grabbed my shoulders and said, who is it? And I said, it's Rudyard Kipling, because he was a journalist who became an author. And she said, oh, thank God it's not somebody stupid. It was the biggest hug. Even then, she was still very protective of Sarah, and she was so glad that I'd done something that she approved of. So that was lovely.
That is a great story. But yeah, like you mentioned, then BBC Books started and you wrote War of the Daleks, which was a little controversial at the time.
I'm good at that.
Right. I was on rec.arts.Doctor Who at the time. Even though I didn't really post much, I was reading a lot of what happened. And yeah, so I saw a lot of the back and forth, which was interesting because I thought that as a writer and knowing how important Doctor Who is, it was interesting that you came on the forum and basically said, look, this is what I'm writing. And as part of what I'm writing, I am required to sort of retcon some of the events of Remembrance of the Daleks. Garo has to come back. But I want you to tell me all the things that you think wouldn't work so I can write around them. And I thought, that's great. You're using all these people who watch frame by frame and, all that stuff and using their knowledge so that you could write the best possible story. But yeah, I saw that there was probably the first time I've ever seen like fans just go crazy angry at somebody.
Well, it turned out, I didn't like I didn't like it. When Remembrance came out, Terry called me up, and I'd never heard him like this before, absolutely fuming. He was furious with it because he said that the destruction of Skaro had not been in the original outline that he had approved. And he was so angry. And he said, that man, meaning JNT, will never have the Daleks again. As it turned out, he didn't have the show again either. And by this point, I had thought, it would be fun to kind of pitch a Doctor Who story to the BBC themselves. So I started writing this outline called War of the Daleks as a 4-part TV series. And I'd written most of it up. And I was going to tell Terry and see what he thought of it. But when I had that call, I realized probably not a good idea, and I shelved it. And when I was asked to do the BBC books, I remembered that one. And I thought, I still like that idea, the War of the Daleks, the idea of the two factions, because I was getting really fed up with the way JNT kept dragging out the Imperial Daleks and Davros Daleks and what have you. And I just wanted to finish it completely. That was the whole idea of War of the Daleks. Just stop that, so he couldn't keep going on with the same thing over and over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the basic concept behind War of the Daleks. And then Terry said, when I asked Terry about doing an original Dalek novel, he said, "Oh, yeah, fine. Go ahead, John. But if you can you bring Skaro back?" And I said, "Not a problem," which I always say when anybody asks me if I can write something, not a problem. And I wrote the outline up from that, and BBC Books approved it. And if you actually read War of the Daleks, you'll see the 4 chapter and the 4 places where the episodes would have ended. And I mean, the first one is the obvious bit where the Daleks come in and they say to the Doctor, you know, "You are the enemy of the Daleks. You will be protected." And then that was going to be the ending of the book. Because you get fed up with them always saying, you know, you are the enemy of the Daleks, you will be destroyed, and then they don't. So I thought, let's do it the other way round. And we went from there. And Terry loved the ideas. He was very happy with what I did with them, especially with the Thals. When I said, you know, the Thals have basically become proto-Daleks. And he said, yes, that's always a danger. And he liked that very much. He was very pleased with me for coming up with that one. So that was the last of my books he actually approved, because he passed away before I wrote the next one. Kind of special in a lot of ways.
So yeah, with that next book, it was Legacy of the Daleks, and included the Master and Susan, set in the post-Dalek invasion of Earth world. So there's a lot of elements coming in from previous Doctor Who stories. Now, this is something where I've heard several different stories about this, and I wanted to hear from you because you're the one who would know.
Yeah.
So it seemed odd to me at the time that it was a story with the Master, the Delgado version of the Master with the Eighth Doctor. And I've heard alternating versions that it was originally going to be a Third Doctor story, but then I've heard another story that, no, it was always going to be an Eighth Doctor story, but you might have suggested at one point that it could be a Third Doctor story. And so I'm just kind of curious, did it start as a Third Doctor story, or was it always an Eighth Doctor story?
Neither, actually. What originally started, and we have to go back to my days in the Doctor Who Appreciation Society. I was editing Cosmic Mask, and I wrote a short story for it in which Susan meets the Roger Delgado Master. And that was the genesis of it, that idea. When I came to write Legacy, I remembered that idea, and I thought, you know, I'd written it as a short story back in 1980, I think, but I thought I could do more with it. And I started planning it around that. So basically it started as a Susan story, and then because it was for an Eighth Doctor series, I thought, well, yeah, he always said he would meet her again, you know, and being the Doctor, he's really, really late at that meeting. And that's how it came about. I also wanted to make it fun by having Susan miss him, quite catch him, and they kind of passing in the night, so he doesn't actually get to meet her. It was a fun idea I had. I thought, well, wouldn't it be funny if after all this time they don't meet? And it grew from that.
Mm-hmm.
I just like the idea of having a sequel to Dalek Invasion Earth, in the sense that we see how things are progressing, and how it's not going quite the way it was expected to go. And also, I wanted to deal with Susan, Susan was my first love on the show. I mean, the Doctor I liked, but Susan was more closer to my age. She was more interesting. She was a kind of spooky girl. So I always had this thing for her. When I had the chance, I thought, okay, I'm going to bring Susan back, you know. So that's how that one came about. And the original story had ended, the short story version had ended with, you know, Delgado's Master being blown up by Susan and then having to regenerate. I mean, that's all from the short story. As a funny part to add to the end of it, I wrote originally a little afterword saying that this story actually originally appeared as a short story in a fanzine. And the editor called me up and says, God, John, I'm sorry, I am not printing that. He says, if I print that, everybody who's ever written for a bloody fanzine in the universe is going to think my story can do that, and I'll be inundated with crazy fan fiction. So he made me take that bit out of the end. I can see his point.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I agree with you about Susan, though, because I mean, when I watched those early ones, I was a young, I was just below teenage, let's say. And I found Carol Ann Ford compelling. I know nowadays it's very popular in fandom to be very negative with Susan, but no, I've always thought that she's very compelling and did a very great job with that role.
Yeah. Mysterious chick.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so now you're working on Dr. Omega. Well, I guess Omega is the British pronunciation.
Dr. Omega, yeah, I call it.
So yeah, I mean, this has been a fascinating revelation to me in recent years because I had never heard of the character before. But the more you investigate it, the more it seems like, could Sidney Newman have had this character in mind when he created Doctor Who? Because there are a lot of crazy similarities between the two characters. And so I'm curious, were you someone who had been familiar with Dr. Omega for years, or was it fairly recently, or how did you come by the character?
Well, my friend Jean-Marc Lefessier edits a series of annual releases called Tales of the Shadowman.
Mm-hmm.
And he owns his own press, his own company in France. And he's been translating a lot of the old French stories into English and reissuing them. And one of the characters he found was Dr. Omega. And he said to me, I think you'll like this guy, and sent me the story. And of course, I loved him, but I had not heard of him before I wrote my first Dr. Omega story for Jean-Marc. There is a huge similarity in places between him and William Hartnell. There's also a lot of differences, which is good. I mean, they're not clones of each other or anything. It was really fascinating. I really found it fun. And somehow or other, he kind of kept diversifying, kept exploding in different directions. And people would say, can you write me a Dr. Omega story? And I would do this and go off. And it was just one of those things. And then Andrew Skeletor said to me, how about we redo him in a new fashion, which is what we've been doing, and giving him a different companion, a backstory for the world that he's living in at this point. And Andrew just let me get away with everything. He just sort of said, okay, John, you're the writer. You write the stories and I'll do the publishing and the illustrating and everything. So we had fun with it, really. It's been good fun. But I don't really, he's not a Hartnell clone. He's not a substitute. He's just someone who has a lot of similarities, but different motivations and things like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about when you had mentioned you gave him the new companion, Miss Amelia Midnight. And, because you go to the original story, because I was sort of fascinated by this, so I did pick up the original novel. And it's told from the point of view of Dennis Borel. And then you've got Fred also as sort of like the strong man, character that goes with them on their journey. And so I was kind of surprised reading that first book when it's like they're left behind. And so I was just kind of curious about why you left behind the established characters that were with him and introduced a new character.
That was Andrew. Andrew came up with the format and he said, we'll keep them in the background. They'll be there and they'll turn up from time to time. But I'd really want to take this new character, Miss Midnight, and use her as well, as making them kind of like a pair of equals but opposites, because he thought it would work better. And I have to admit, it's great fun writing the dialogue between them, because they have very different aims and very different points of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will say from my point of view, I have really enjoyed the dialogue in those books, especially There were the characters you introduced in the first one that were sort of like intelligent velociraptors that I particularly found hilarious, but also it worked within the story, but it was also just these very, very erudite, sophisticated velociraptors.
What originally Dr. Omega was going to be was like the old English Christmas annuals. There would be a mixture of text story and comic strip. And that was how Andrew had originally envisaged it. So the first novel, in fact, was made up from 3 short stories that I'd written, 3 little bits that were going to be, the idea was that it was going to be short stories scattered through the book that linked together to make the whole story. But then he found that it would be too expensive to do what he had in mind. So then he switched to just doing it as a novel. So I basically had to go back, take the stories and rewrite them as a novel. But I like the idea of doing the unexpected, because you get fed up with doing alien invasions and things like that because they're overused. And I really wanted to steer away from that kind of thing completely. And I thought, wouldn't it be funny to have intelligent, because you see the shows now, the intelligent velociraptors, and who have terribly English mannerisms. It just struck me as funny, but at the same time, why not? Because who's to say? That's why when I gave him a translator device, I pointed out that it's not translating literally, it's translating the meaning. Not actually what they're saying, but what they're meaning. So as a result of which, I could give them any kind of personality I wanted. And that was fun. That was great fun. We've done the 2 novels completely. Book 3 he has at the moment, and he's been distracted, unfortunately, but it's book 3. I actually got so enthralled with it, I wrote 6.
Oh.
There are 6 already finished novels, and it was kind of fun to do. The book 6 is probably one of my favorites, because I thought, let's do something completely unexpected and different. And book 6 is a film noir kind of setting. It's actually told from the first person, and the main character is a Los Angeles private eye in the 1940s. And Dr. Omega doesn't even turn up until about halfway through the book. But I wanted to do, because we could do this, I thought. We aren't in the position where they're with Doctor Who, where you can't do that, because you've got to sell Doctor Who, because that's who the people tuning in expect to see. And if you're paying your lead actor lots and lots of money, you don't want them sitting around doing nothing for half the show. So I thought, well, we can do this with this book, because, we can use Dr. Omega in any way, shape, or form we'd like. We're not paying him. He can sit out half the book if there's some other interesting story going on. So we were just experimenting. We were playing around with ideas and concepts and things, and just having a huge amount of fun with it.
Yeah, I think that comes through, as a reader. You can tell when a writer is enjoying what they're doing, or when a writer is just like, I have to produce this content because it's expected. I'm actually reading something right now that it feels like to me that, I don't know for sure, but it feels to me like the writer feels like, oh, I have a deadline.
Yeah. And that's the exact thing we didn't want. Yeah, we didn't want anybody to feel like we were forced to write this. And as a writer, there's nobody watching me write. Nobody knows whether I'm working or not. All they know is sooner or later a product comes out at the other end. But to motivate myself each day to write, I have to be going, I can't wait to get on to the next chapter. I'm so enthralled in it myself. I really, really want to do this. And I'm at the point where I can choose. I can just simply say, that doesn't sound like it will be fun. Or this sounds like I'm going to have the most heck of a fun run with it. So that's basically what I do nowadays, is I say, I'm only doing projects that really, really will get me motivated. And certainly Dr. Omega did. As I said, I wrote 6 books before I stopped and then said, oh, yeah, right, we're still publishing number 1. But I didn't care. I was having too much fun to stop.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of life left to the series, because
Yes.
I read the first 2 and now I'm ready for number 3. So I'm glad to hear that he has it for when he's able to publish it.
Yeah. Number 3 is an alien invasion story, but it's an alien invasion on another planet.
Mhm.
So it's one species of aliens invading another species of aliens. And that was more interesting from that point of view. It avoided the usual aliens coming to Earth routine, which we've had I've had so much of. So I'm kind of a bit done out with that one. Every time I'm doing alien invasions these days, it's kind of like, what can I do that's really different?
Yeah.
And the answer is not a lot. So that's why I kind of avoid them a lot.
You touched on it a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to ask you is, how do you feel writing for Dr. Omega is different from writing? I mean, you mentioned one thing, which is that you can do something unusual, like have the Doctor sit out for half the story, but do you find that there's any other differences in how you approach writing for Dr. Omega versus the Doctor?
It's probably not easy to explain, but they don't seem like the same character at all to me, because I have to get inside their heads when I'm writing them. I mean, Dr. Omega isn't as cranky as the Hartnell Doctor. He's very egotistical, but at the same time, I think he's more empathic than the Hartnell character, especially after Miss Midnight kicks him around a bit. Then he starts realizing, oh yes, I've got to think of somebody else. Whereas with Dennis Borel and Fred, he was in charge and they just bowed to everything he said. Whereas she does not. Emphatically does not bow to everything he says. So he's having to be a bit more relatable in that sense, I think. And other than that, yeah, he's got a lot of Hartnell in him. I mean, he's got the scientific arrogance of Hartnell. That's certainly true. And he does like to be appreciated or almost worshipped, if you like, for being who he is. But I've made him he's a quieter kind of chap. He doesn't, rush in and do things. He's quite happy to sit in his ship with a cup of tea and a good book. And he doesn't feel compelled to go out and do things. He usually gets dragged into them. And then again, Hartnell was too.
Right.
As I say, I can see the difference in my mind, but I'm not sure I can explain it properly.
Right. Well, and totally too, because when I was reading the books, I expected them to feel very much like, because I knew that's, a lot of people in fandom were saying, like, Sidney Newman, because he was raised in Canada, he might have been exposed to this book, which was a French book, and, et cetera. And so I was expecting the books to read as if they were Hartnell stories, but they feel more like adventure serials to me. And it feels tonally even. It doesn't feel like 60s Doctor Who. It feels like it's definitely, it still feels like it's from another era, but I mean that in a good way. Like it's something that we don't have now that's actually exciting, to like read from another era. But yeah, I don't know if you feel like that there's any truth to that, but that's what I get. It feels like an adventure serial when I read it.
Yeah. Well, the stories I write for Jean-Marc are based on classic stories. So I try and write them in the manner they would have been written if the original author had written them. So I tried to make originally Dr. Omega as close to the novel's character as I could and everything. With the new series, with the Andrews book, I've changed that somewhat. I've put some of that into the background. But I always try and remain authentic. I mean, that's the key to writing a good Doctor Who novel. The character has to read like the character you've seen on the TV. It can't be your interpretation of the character. It's got to be the original character in a new story. And I do the same with these stories, that they should be like the originals, not too alike, because sometimes the attitudes of the writer back then are a little off, as you probably realize. I mean, I've written pastiches of Jules Verne, and Verne was very anti-Semitic. So, I'm not going to do that Verne.
Right.
Jules Verne pushed a little bit into a slightly better direction, but that kind of thing. And that's how I see writing Dr. Omega. It's pushing the original just a little bit, but staying true, so that I can imagine that if Galopin was writing them nowadays, this is the kind of thing he would be writing with it.
Oh, that's interesting. Like I say, I'm a fan of the books, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes from these stories as they continue. And hopefully, beyond once 6 are published, there'll be more to come after that.
Oh, I would hope so. I've had such fun with them. They've been some of the most entertaining writing I've done in a long time.
But yeah, John, thank you. I think our time is up now, but I really appreciated you coming on the show and talking about Doctor Who and Dr. Omega. And I hope that you have a great rest of your evening, and feel free to stop by the 42 cast anytime.
Okay, terrific. I've had a great deal of fun remembering all these things, actually. Yes.
And that's it for the interview with John Peel. John, if you're listening to this, thank you again for being very generous with your time and sitting down and talking with me. I had a good time talking with you, and you're welcome on the 42 cast anytime if you want to talk about your next book or anything like that. It doesn't have to be a full interview or anything of that nature, so just let me know. But now I'm interested in what all of you who are listening thought. What do you like about the episodes? What do you not like about the episodes? You can let us know in a variety of ways. One way is to email us at everything@42cast.com. Another way is to go to our website at 42cast.com and leave us feedback on any of the episodes. You can go to our Facebook, which is facebook.com/42cast. You can tweet to us at 42cast, or you can go to our Instagram at 42cast. You can also leave us reviews on Stitcher or Apple Podcasts. The reviews are actually really helpful on Apple Podcasts because Apple uses those reviews as a way of determining what shows to promote. The more reviews a podcast has, the more that they are going to promote that podcast. So if you have any time, you've got an Apple account, please just leave some feedback on there. Help promote the 42 cast. I also want to mention the ESO Patreon. That is something that helps all of the shows on the ESO network, not just the 42 cast. It helps us all keep running, all doing what we're doing. So if you want to check that out, you can go to patreon.com/ESO network. There are several different tiers. They'll give you access to some shows that have early episodes. Some shows have exclusive episodes. There's a whole podcast that is exclusive to the ESO Network Patreon, so you can check that out. So if you have any extra funds and would like to contribute, then we would definitely appreciate it. And finally, you can also check me out on Time Streams, which is the other podcast that I am currently on, where my friend Juliet and I are watching through all of Doctor Who from the beginning, giving our commentary on it. You don't have to watch the episodes because we tell you what happened in the episodes. So if you just want to hear us talking about the show and just want to sort of learn about Doctor Who from us talking, you can do that. Or you can watch the episodes before listening to our podcast about it, and in which case you'll probably get a little more out of it, but definitely wanted to set things up so that people didn't have to watch the show to watch the podcast. And I'm also going to plug Legendary Forces, which will be out soon with our first episode, but that's where we're going to watch through all of Star Wars fictional media, myself, Joe Heath, Ashley Pauls, Corinne Vitek, and also Juliet again. She's not just on Time Streams. And we're watching through all of Star Wars fictional media from the beginning. And that's already starting to be a very fascinating podcast because of just how different the expanded media was in those early days in the 1970s. So we will review the content. We will let you know if it's worth checking out. So yeah, definitely check out Legendary Forces, and I'll let you know on the 42 cast when that is available. But that's it for our show this week. Join us back next week when Billy D. Williams will not be joining us. And until then, this is Nathan, signing off. You have been listening to the 42 Cast, copyright 2021. Got a question for the ultimate answer? Contact us at everything@42cast.com. Theme music is Sharper Swords by Brandon Ellis. Check out more of his work at www.cityfires.com. The 42 Cast is a proud member of the ESO Network.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.